Yeah. Well, your last elective is how to procedurally constrain planless affirmatives, i.e., fairness as an impact. So, goal of this discussion is to give you sort of a frame of reference for situating fairness as a terminal impact rather than just an internal link, and then some tips and tricks to answer specific counter interpretations that planless affirmatives might give, and describe how to optimize sort of the strategy, organization, and execution of topicality arguments in your negative speeches. Before I start, I do want to forefront for everyone that this is one of many takes on topicality against planless AFs. And there are a number of different people and a number of different schools of thought on T, and each has sort of varying levels of effectiveness in front of different sets of judges. But the reason why I'm introducing this particular take about fairness as an impact is because I do think it's the most effective and sort of is truest to the idea that you're making a topicality argument at the level of form, rather than a larger framework argument about the content of the 1AC. We'll sort of unpack what that means a little later. So let's start with the question of why is fairness a terminal impact? Okay, so a lot of times I think debaters get stuck on the idea that fairness is an internal link rather than an impact, right? So imagine this scenario, which I think is illustrative, but maybe a little insane. So the 1AC reads an affirmative about stopping an impending asteroid collision on Earth and says it's going to cause extinction. Does not mention NATO at all. The 1NC reads a T violation, needs to defend NATO, and says that underlimiting the topic to just include anything related to asteroids would be pretty unfair. The 2AC critiques T, finds a card that we have to put all other issues on timeout because the impending asteroid collision has to be discussed first, and the extinction caused by the asteroid collision outweighs the breach of fairness in one debate. TKO for the AF, right? So, like, surely extinction through asteroids matters more than being unfair to one team in one debate. Okay. A more believable example, the 1AC reads an affirmative about historical challenges the debate community has had with racist pref sheets. There are a number of schools that pref white judges higher and black judges lower because they think the race of a judge determines their biases. The 1NC reads TUSFG, says underlimiting the topic would be unfair. Those who say fairness is an internal link, right, rather than an impact would likely vote affirmative because surely racism within debate outweighs being unfair to one team in one debate, right? So to grapple with sort of these examples and hypotheticals and why fairness is still a relevant consideration, I sort of want to start with the question of what makes debate a unique activity, okay? What makes debate a unique activity? Surely it's not education. You can learn about a lot of things by reading books, going to school, attending English or history classes, even if it's something specific like legal education. Surely that's something that you could do more with, activist organizing, starting an internship with a law firm, or maybe working with your local state and like national representative. There are other activities also like mock trial that more accurately simulate the inside of a courtroom, right? Surely it's not iterative testing, whatever that phrase means, right? Really vacuous. You can learn how to improve your writing and craft and refine your arguments by participating in essay contests. You could literally never attend a debate tournament ever, and throughout the process of writing, for example, a thesis in college or a master's thesis, learn how to refine arguments about an area of study if you really wanted to, right? So the thing that makes debate unique, right? The thing that makes debate unique is the convergence of competition and a research activity. It's the convergence of competition with a research activity. What makes policy debate unique from other formats of debate is that your ability to win is conditioned on the quality of research that you've compiled to further your argument. And that debates are then decided based on who did the better debating, rather than having the judge vote for you on how you looked that day, how they felt about an argument prior to the debate. Okay. Why does that matter? Why did I just go on a big rant about, what is sort of so unique about debate? Well, it kind of means that fairness is an intrinsically valuable part of the activity. Okay. Fairness is an intrinsically valuable part of the activity. This is an area the debaters extending TUSFG tend not to explain very well beyond the phrase, quote, fairness is an intrinsic good, period, and not much else. Okay. Fairness is, not just a value that the negative team wants, right? The condition for a neg ballot isn't really fairness outweighs asteroids or fairness outweighs racism, which is impossible to win, right? Rather, both sides think that fairness is an intrinsic good. So both sides think that fairness is important. Okay, here's an example for why this is true. Let's say you are the team reading the asteroids out for some god awful reason. Come the camp tournament, that's the AF you're reading. Okay. The debate carries on from the two ACs. It's like, let's take the hypothetical where it was like asteroids extinction, neg, T, NATO, like talk about it. 2AC was like asteroids matter more than NATO. Extinction outweighs fairness. Okay. Let's say the debate carries on from the 2AC. You're debating me. I'm really incompetent. And in the 2C, I basically dropped the argument that we have to put the NATO topic on timeout because we have to focus on asteroids and asteroid extinction outweighs fairness. I just dropped this argument throughout the debate. Okay. I dropped this argument in the negative block. I dropped this argument in the 2NR. The 2AR goes for it. The judge votes neg. And it's like decided they weren't persuaded by the AF. The AF team probably would be pissed. You would be pissed. You would probably 3NR about that, right? You'd be like, didn't they drop this argument several times in the debate? It's like, yeah, that's pretty tough. That's because at an intrinsic level, right, the affirmative team also expects debates to be evaluated fairly in tabula rasa, right? They expect judges to have flowed. They expect opponents to answer their arguments. And they expect judges to vote for arguments that they don't 100% agree with, if executed better than the other team. So, I think the thing that you kind of want to focus on when talking about why fairness is an important impact is not simply that it's like bigger. Like, I don't think you're going to win like fairness outweighs extinction or racism or ableism or whatever ism you're talking about, right? But to sort of discuss why both the affirmative and the negative team subscribe to certain elements of fairness as a norm, right? So, instead of focusing on just like debate is a competition, you want to sort of align your 2C fairness impact to explain why all teams, not just the neg or the AF, rely on concepts of fairness for debate to work. Another example for why there's an expectation for competition and fairness. Let's say the AF reads the 1AC about racist practices that we sort of talked about before. It's like debate community has a bunch of racist practices. 1NC does not repeat the 1AC, just says we should protest about racial profiling because police violence is more important than pref violence. Okay. If you're the 2AC, what would be the most logical argument that you came up with? Yeah. Okay, so you would say perm to both, right? You'd be like, that doesn't seem very competitive. And the affirmatives likely make a perm. So permutation arguments, right, literally a test of competition, prove that competition is an intrinsic part of the debate, right? It can't just be that they have a bunch of non sequiturs and then the non sequitur could win the debate on the negative, right? Think about it another way. So it's like if debate was truly less about the competition and more about things like education or subject formation, right? How could a negative team win on an off-case position but lose on dropping conditionality, right? It's like, if they're right substantively about every part of the debate except for conditionality, it's like the negative should likely win, right? No, debate is in fact a competition, and there is sort of an intrinsic question about how we play the game and sort of making the debate game work, right? So that theory about sort of fair practices, should not matter if debate was just an intellectual exercise about ethics. But it does matter because it is, largely a competition. Okay. So that makes sense in terms of just like phrasing debate as sort of a competition and fairness as being important for potentially both sides. Is that everybody sort of follow me on that? Okay. So we've sort of wrapped up why, both teams might implicitly agree with fairness. So the next step is to think about sort of the relationship with fairness between that and sort of the pedagogical outcome of the 1AC. Okay. So a lot of times people sort of make the, base claim that's like fairness, turns the case because if you, can't predict their arguments, then you can't really be well read about them. And like that turns the case, right? So it's like the education that they really wanted us to get, we didn't quite get it because you were unfair and we couldn't research your thing. It's like, that's effective sometimes. I would say like that's like the base level fundamental claim that you can make. Sometimes it's not really that sufficient to assume an affirmative impact turn is always about like education or broader learning. So like, for example, an affirmative impact turn might not really be about education, but maybe the need for a certain identity to be able to have self-expression in debate. So like maybe, I'm an Asian person. Maybe I'm making the argument that's just like, we need more Asian people in the elims of, X tournament. Okay. Let's say that that's the argument. It's like fairness turns education doesn't really answer that argument, right? It's like, it doesn't really matter how much we've learned, right? The question is just about who has won the debate. So it's like, fairness does not cause more Asian people to win debates per se. It's like, it doesn't really make sense to make that sort of turns case style argument. So instead, sort of, you want to make sure that your, fairness turns the AF impact arguments are more specific, right? So like, for example, using the self-expression example, instead of being like, fairness is key to representation, which is probably not that true. I might make some arguments that are like fairness is key to sort of deep engagement with issues about, identity. So it's like if I'm unprepared, I'm more likely to make a set of arguments that tend to be more generic rather than specific. I'll likely not respond to the, for example, let's say an affirmative is focused on issues of, Latino representation. It's like if I don't have any cards and didn't research that in advance, then it is very unlikely that I'm going to have a specific strategy. I'm likely to just sort of phone it in with like some Baudrillard or like a T argument or Marx, right? Because like I don't really have a very specific strategy to write. So it's like it might decrease the quality of engaging with certain people, certain identities, like fully researched strategies to sort of respond to some of those arguments, right? So it's like you might make the argument that the lack of fairness would result in suboptimal outcomes for self-expression, for example. So it's like you want to sort of really think about the way that a fair debate in which both sides can participate really maximizes the good that the planless affirmative is talking about, and sort of describes sort of why fairness is the thing that maybe is the controlling factor of that. Okay, so I think we've kind of beat the dead horse on like fairness, maybe good, maybe it turns the case. Okay. Next question is just like, how do we gauge whether a team has been sufficiently fair with regards to topicality? Okay. The answer is pretty simple. It's like topicality is about interpretations of the resolution, right? So the resolution like was given in advance in like January, and it's included in all the tournament invitations, and it tells us the topic for the debate. Okay. And in debate, we decide how to interpret, the resolution through definitions, right? And debating sort of T is about sort of, interpreting the words in the resolution and deciding whether or not it is sufficiently limited for a year's worth of debates. Okay. The thing that I kind of want to stress here is that a lot of times people make topicality arguments about planless apps about ground. Okay. That is a mistake. So a lot of times people will be like, the reason why I couldn't debate this app is because I couldn't get, for example, the politics disadvantage, or maybe I couldn't get things like NATO bad. I don't think that's a very good line of argumentation. Okay. It's never really about ground. Because there's always ground for, engaging in affirmative. So let's say, I debated an affirmative that says that Afro-pessimism is a valid theory to describe the world. That's literally all it said. Didn't really talk about NATO. That app definitely has ground, right? It's like you could certainly, without reading a topicality argument, read arguments on the negative that are like Afro-pessimism is a bad theory because it doesn't include things like, historical materialism, i.e. a Marxism K. It might be like humanism is actually good. Afro-pessimism, is a rejection of humanism. Humanism is key to solve existential threats, a humanism K. So it's like there's always ground, right? So it doesn't really make sense to situate it in terms of that. And there's also never really a God-given right to ground, right? So it's like last year, core ground, I would say potentially the BizCon DA was one of the DAs that was like core ground that you could read against the app sometimes, right? Let's say that that's the case. It's like, it would be pretty weird if this year you were like, oh yeah, like you didn't read a plan and like our core ground of the BizCon DA is gone. It's like, well, the BizCon DA has no relationship to the NATO security cooperation topic, right? So it's like, it's not like there's like a God-given right to a certain set of ground for every affirmative that's like decided in advance. So it's like, really the question is about limits, right? So it's not about like whether or not you get arguments to make. It's like, you'll inevitably get them. It's like, the question is whether or not the argument set that you're given is predictable, and that there's a limited set of things that you're, working on so you can write a case next. So like thinking about just like, debating some of this topicality stuff, right? The reason why you're making a T argument is because you don't have a very good substantive strategy because you didn't get a chance to research it. So like, it's largely a question of, it's like, if I was like, if you, there's two different topics. One of the topics has 5,000 affirmatives. The other topic has 50 affirmatives. Which one would the negative prefer to debate? Why? Okay, why? Okay, so like I'll take a little bit of issue with like less preparation, but it does mean like you can go in depth on 50 issues, right? So it's like you might still prepare the same amount of time as like you're preparing 5,000 cases, but it's like if there are 5,000 cases, my prep strategy would likely be something like, all right, let me focus on writing some generics that apply to 5,000 cases, not like one case finished, check, two cases finished, check, right? It's like that's kind of unworkable. It's like if it's like 50, it's like more workable to like go through like one by one and have a specific strategy. So it's all about limits. It's not really about ground. Okay. A few sort of thoughts about sort of debating, framework arguments and topicality arguments. So usually sort of the top of the 2 in C and the top of the 2 in R is where you would describe sort of the impact of fairness. Why is it an intrinsically important thing, and why does it turn the case? It's usually kind of the overview component. You don't want to go overboard. You don't want to like debate all of the arguments that you're making on framework in the overview in a 4 to 6 minute fashion. That's bad. You also don't want to like not start with anything, because you do want like some, semblance of a base of like, what is the motive for debate? Is it something that is primarily competitive, or is it primarily something else, something that they'll likely question, right? And then like you want to sort of establish some of your impact arguments, just like you would establish like disadd impact calc stuff at the top. It's like you're doing kind of the same thing. The rest of the stuff should be on the line by line. There's sort of a couple things I kind of want to talk about. I want to talk about counter interpretations, and I want to talk about impact terms and how to deal with them. Okay, so first thing, counter interpretations. I think there's sort of a couple things that you want to do when debating an affirmative counter interpretation for a planless affirmative. Okay, you want to make sure that you have a case list of affirmatives that counter interpretation includes that you think would be unreasonable to debate. Let's return back to asteroids. Right? Let's say my counter interp was like, debate is only going to be about asteroids and not going to be about, okay? It's like and then it's like the affirmative, then the negative is like, yeah, that's unfair and unpredictable. And I respond back, I'm like, actually, it is really predictable and really fair. There's only one F. It's only about asteroids. That's the thing that you need to debate. It's so fair. NATO security cooperation is so much bigger and so unlimited. What would the neg response be to that argument? Speak up a little bit. Sorry, I can't hear you. Well, I mean, all the literature right now says the asteroid is the bigger issue. So, okay. So maybe it's not grounded in the resolution. Yeah. Yeah. So like it's tied to a predictability argument about the resolution. Yeah. Okay, so like you could do one of two things, right? You could be like, it's not predictable because it's not based on the resolution. And then the other thing you can do is create a case list of like, here's a bunch of affirmatives that this interpretation would allow. It's not like only one asteroid's AF exists. There's plenty of ways to deflect and monitor and et cetera asteroids. It's like, that's a pretty big topic. It's like asteroids go is not a great topic, right? The thing that you sort of want to do is you want to establish a very particular case list that describes a set of affirmatives that the AF interpretation that would include that would be both unpredictable and not very easy to write a case negative to. Okay, few guidelines about this case list. So the case list has to be realistic. It has to be realistic. A lot of times people make this mistake by saying something like, let's say, you're reading you're debating an affirmative that's talking about racist debate community practices, right? And then, the 1NC goes, the 2AC is like counter interp, like we should talk about issues in the debate community. That's really important. The 2NC will go like apeshit bananas on the case list and be like, that allows for affirmatives that like truisms, like 2 + 2 = 4 is now an AF. It's like, okay, like that's not a very good case list because no one is reading the 2 + 2 = 4 AF. That AF loses on presumption because you haven't proven anything that is better than the status quo. There's a reason why no one is reading that, right? Or like they'll be like, yeah, it just allows other teams to say racism bad, like big thumbs up, and like that's the AF. It's like, no one really reads that AF either because that also loses on presumption, right? It's like you haven't solved the problem. Racism exists in the status quo. So it's like the thing that you really want to do is you want to describe the case list that is actually realistic that people would read. So, I actually like that example of the case list with asteroids because it's like, yeah, like you can talk about different mechanisms or different agents that can do things with regards to asteroids. Like if I was like resolved asteroids, put together your neg. It's like, yeah, I mean like put together your AF. Like we're in week 1 of DDI. Like what are people's ideas in resolved asteroids? It's like there's probably a lot of stuff, right? Like not just the federal government, probably every other agent, international and domestic. Probably every mechanism, right? It's like monitoring asteroids, deflecting asteroids, like nuking an asteroid, whatever it is. It's like now you have like 1,000 AFs. It's like that's sort of the process by which you want to write the case list is like something that presumably someone would actually write, right? That could be an affirmative, right? The second is that you want it tailored to the counter interpretation. Okay. Second feature of this case list, it needs to be tailored to the counter interpretation. I think a lot of times people will make case list examples that don't fit the counter interpretation that's being debated. So like, let's say I'm doing the asteroids AF and I'm like, asteroids, bigger issue, like counter interp asteroids, right? It's like, you can't in the 2NC be like, here's my case list. Like it includes things like racism is bad and 2 + 2 = 4. It's like, no, my counter interpretation only includes resolved asteroids. So like, obviously that case list is not included, right? It's like you want to make sure that the case list that you're talking about is tailored to the counter interpretation you're debating, right? Another more believable example, like there are people that make the argument like that's like the federal government is the people, or like the federal government is an assemblage or something like that. Basically, to mean that like the defense of the United States federal government could be done by another actor, right? Being like a case list is that that case list includes 2 + 2 = 4. It's like no, it doesn't. It only includes affirmatives that increase security cooperation, albeit maybe not by the government in DC, but whatever we constitute as a state, right? So it's like you want to write a case list that's very specific to that, right? So in that case, what would sort of the way that you might describe a case list against this state as an assemblage or federal government as the people? What would that sound like if you're neg? Like, what are the affirmatives that interpretation that's like the state as an assemblage would allow that you wouldn't be super pleased to hear if you're neg? Yeah. Okay, so it might include like we write letters, so like that's one agent. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so I think you could so I think you could think about it as like, so I'll like take both of your examples. You can think about it as basically the agent shifts, right? So it's like an affirmative could be like we as people do some stuff. It could be like individual bureaucrats in the federal government will go now desecuritize against Russia, not the federal government, just like individuals in it, like people in Washington D.C. Like, yeah, like it could be like certain movements will do something. It's like Black Lives Matters will start security cooperation with NATO. It could mean that like sub organizations like the 50 states will now start doing it. State National Guards will start doing it. Does that kind of make sense? It's like you want to tailor your counter interpretation in such a way that it applies to the thing that is being described, as opposed to being like you open the floodgates to everything, and then like the everything that you're talking about is not included in the counter interpretation. It's like that's kind of the thing you want to avoid. The third sort of guideline is, and I sort of started doing this before, is you want the case list to include both critical and policy strategies. You want to think about it from the perspective not just critique debaters, but also what policy, people who like to read plans will do, as sort of, the drawing board. So let's say I'm like, okay, USFG is the people. That's the topic. Okay. Like everybody agrees, like just fiat it in. Like the DDI is all writing apps about USFG's people. The rest of it is like security cooperation with NATO, right? It's like, if I'm like, okay, so like what apps do we want to write? Some of you will probably be like critique apps. So like some of you might be like, oh yeah, like the people will like, desecuritize and like kumbaya, Russia, about ass, right? My guess is that some of the more policy minded people might go in other directions. So if I was like, the state is an assemblage, so it doesn't have to be the government in DC. It does not matter where it is. It just needs to be a group of people. It's like, okay, I'm probably about to write the EU counterplan as an affirmative, or the G20 counterplan as an affirmative. I'll be like, the G20 will do it. The U.S. federal government isn't a body, DC. It's just an assemblage. We are in an assemblage with the European Union, right? It's like you can sort of like change the actor. I might be like the 50 state national government, or sorry, 50 state national guards will go do security cooperation. Fun and sad fact, there are some cards out there that say that the 50 state national guards can go and cooperate with NATO. That is a counterplan that exists this year. In any case, it's like the affirmative can still make the set of arguments that then, it's like that case list is like looking a lot bigger. So like thinking about like, what is the KM lab going to research? It's like, yeah, Klarman's probably going to be like, let's go full deranged. Like we're the EU now. We're an assemblage with the EU, right? It's like, that would be pretty bad. So like you should include sort of case list examples, both from the perspective of like, what would teams that likely read the critique say? And what would teams that likely read policy arguments do to innovate and sort of craft their thing in? So I want to talk about like 2 other sort of counter interpretation examples. Okay. Going back, I'm Asian. So let's say that my counter interpretation is only Asian debaters can violate the topic. What might the case list that you generate say? So like if you're neg and trying to answer that counter interp, what's wrong with that counter? What are the cases that that interpretation allows? Yeah. Like what? Okay, so yes, you're right. It is about everything. It is about maybe, that. It's like, again, like going back to it has to be realistic, right? So it's like making donuts the official breakfast food, like I guess, but like, is the app going to get read? Like, maybe, maybe not. Like, I would basically instead be like, your interpretation means Asian debaters can literally bring back any topic. So like they can now debate the CJR topic and say that like the CFAA needs to be limited. They can bring back like the China like constructive engagement topic and be like, we need to constructively engage China over nanotechnology. They can, and then like, so like the thing I would do is I would basically start thinking about the topics you debated in previous years. And you're like, you said Asian debaters can debate about any topic. Like, here are the different topics. And like, just think about the amount of research that you did on each topic. Now you have to do it literally in one, right? It's like, that's a much more compelling story than like the very general broad thing that's just like, you can do anything. And they're like, yeah, that is what we said. You can do anything. That's good. It's like you want to sort of make it like unreasonable by having a bunch of examples that are realistic, that are grounded in things. Okay. And we talked about USFGs with people. I mean, another sort of example of this is when people say things like our counter interpretation is a discussion of the topic, right? How many of you have heard that against a planless half? Maybe some of you. Okay. Like, how might we debate the case list on discussion of the topic? Possibly, although my guess is that the people who say that they're discussion of the topic will say that they're topical. So it's like, here's an example. AF is like, the colonial history of NATO is bad in security cooperation, and like, it's historically been really bad about cyber. Wrote AF. Okay. And it's like NEG is like T like USFG, like increased security cooperation, like what's happening. And then the AF is like, don't worry, counter discussion of the topic. Like we talked about NATO and cyber. Like deal with it. That should be enough. What's the two ends retort back? Like, what's the case list that the two end comes back with? Yeah. Okay, so like it might mean like you have to literally defend every historical decision the NATO has ever made, and that is a discussion that is at least not that tangential, like kind of related to the topic. Yeah. Yeah, so discussion of the topic doesn't have a direction, obviously, right? So it's like I discussed NATO. It's like, yeah, got it. But like you can definitely talk about increasing, decreasing, and keeping the same. All of those things are all discussions of NATO and cyber, right? So it's like kind of difficult to have that debate, right? It's like, like you can't really cut a DA that makes any sense logically because like you can go in any direction you want. So it's like the plea that's just like, oh, like I mean, it's a discussion of the topics. It's about NATO, so like you should be able to find some cards. It's like, well, like kinda, like it's just like multi-directionally anything about NATO is kind of a very very tough place for the negative to be in. Yeah, everybody follows this. Everybody feels good about like putting together a case list and thinking about like counter interpretation specifically. So it's like, yeah, that's like one thing that I think teams need to do better is like you just want to logically think about what are the cases that are included within the counter described, as opposed to being like autopilot. Here are a bunch of things I'm going to read about fairness. Yeah, I would say at least I would think of it's not so much like the number. I think it's more just like it needs to illustrate that the type of case negatives and disads you would write would be really different. So it's like if I was like, let's say that it unlimits the agent, right? So it's like anybody is now the federal government. It's like, well, that would include individuals like you and me. It would include all collective organizations and NGOs in the United States, BLM, Me Too movement, anything else. It would also include like global movements, Ukrainian pacifists. It would also include the European Union for a policy example, right? So it's like it's not like a set number, but it like does show the sort of absurdity of where the case snag is going. I think like one way to think about it is you want at least like a example of like a critical aff, maybe like two, and then like a example or maybe two of a policy affirmative that the people could read, right? So it's like, if it's no Asian territory, it's like, individuals and grassroots organizations is like 1 and 2. And if it's like policy teams, it might be like the EU and then the 50 states are an example of, assemblage, right? So that's sort of the way that I would, yeah. Cool. Sort of last section that I kind of want to talk about is how to debate impact turns. How to debate impact turns to topicality. So impact turns to topicality kind of, they fit in a couple of places, but they functionally are like one of two things. They're either arguments that say things like the way that you have narrowed the topic has some pedagogical outcomes that are negative. So it's like, your focus on the North Atlantic Treaty Organization ignores the South Atlantic or the history of the South Atlantic, including Latin America and Africa. So it's like, you might make a bunch of like pedagogical claims about the resolution. And you're like, this is bad. Or they're about sort of impact turns about the procedural exclusion itself. So not really about the substance of the topic, but literally the sort of attempt to confine the intellectual production of certain marginalized populations is a bad thing, period. So it's like, you should not get to tell, for me, you should not get to tell Asian people what to do, period. Right. So it's like, those are usually like the two hats that I put like impact turns in. So it's like, it's either like more expanded topic good or like, don't tell me what to do functional, right? I think like there's sort of this 3-prong test that I suggest for whenever you're answering an impact turn that you should use. Okay. 3-prong test. The first prong is no link. Okay. First prong is no link. The second prong is does the ballot or the counter-interp remedy it? So does the ballot or counter-interp remedy it? We'll describe these in a second. Third prong is it's a double turn with the counter-interpretation. It's a double turn with the counter-interpretation. So anytime you see an impact turn, I want you to take that impact turn and do this sort of 3-prong test and see which argument applies. Almost 100% of the time, one of them will. Okay. So the first one is no link. A lot of times you might describe that the sort of, impact that they're describing to why topicality is bad is just like incorrect, right? So here's a common one from the CJR topic from a couple of years back. People used to make the argument that like topicality is kind of like policing. Like they, it's kind of like the police stopping you and then saying you can't do your thing and then like, basically taking you to jail. Okay. People who are reading topicality on the negative would likely disagree with that characterization, right? So you can make no link arguments that describe that topicality is not the thing that they're saying. Now, the thing about no links is that it is not sufficient to just say the word no link. So I think like a lot of times people would fail because they would just be like, T is not a prison, no link here. It's like, yes, obviously, but like you need to do the debating and warranting to describe what the differences are, right? So let's say I'm trying to make this, let's say I'm I'm reading an aff about prisons. Neg was like, what happened in the NATO topic, like T-NATO? And I was like, topicality puts me in a prison. What is the negative response? How are you going to describe the no link argument? Why is topicality not like this? Yeah. Okay, so that's the double turn with the counter-interp stuff, which we'll get back in a second. But like, how might you describe why topicality is not a prison? So you're only making the no link argument. Yeah. Well, I mean, prisons also describe what kind of behaviors are acceptable and what should happen, what shouldn't. Maybe. I imagine that the affirmative would come up and be like, well, no, but topicality is like a prison because it does try to regulate the speech that we have. Prisons also do that. Like, there are guards and your judge is kind of like a guard. Okay, so you might be like punishments are, different. So like obviously both in terms of like the gravity of the punishment, right? It's like no, topicality is not like going to jail. You're not cuffed. Like debate is a voluntary activity, right? Like you're not getting booked. Like you're not about to if you lose a tea debate, you're not going to have like something on your permanent record, right? It's like obviously there are some differences. Yeah. Yeah, so I like the latter more than the former. So the former one that's just like they establish rules. It's like I'd be like, well, prisons also make rules, like so, like, but like the latter part, you're right. Like you don't really get to contest the law, right? It's like the law is what it is, and it's like, did you do it or not? Like you can go to a court, but it's like the question is just, did you break the law that was already there or not? Are we creating new laws that then get me out of the sentence? Yeah, yeah. Okay, so maybe there's TVA arguments. We'll talk about that in a second because I do have some objections to sort of the way TVAs are debated. But yeah, like potentially no link argument. Yeah. Okay, so similar thoughts. I read on the neg means like you can probably debate your thing. It's just like on the app, you can't. Okay, so like the reason why I'm kind of going in depth, this seems kind of tedious and stupid. It's like obviously topicality is not the same thing as going to a literal prison. Is like the part of the debate that people are missing is kind of like the obvious component of like the warranting of the art because they're going to be like T and sort of the logic of prisons and logic to T are very similar, like rules based, top down, disciplinary, you get punished, right? And the thing that you really want to do when you're describing a no link is to then describe what the differences are. So it's like prison is not voluntary. Debate is in fact a voluntary activity. You are not punished forever in debate. You lose a debate. That is not really a punishment. The gravity of the punishment is pretty different. It's not like you're in solitary, right? It's like these might be very obvious claims, but it's like these are kind of the claims that you want to make to distinguish the two things. Another example that you'll likely hear, I don't know if many of you have debated a boat yard of some kind, but they've likely said that your topicality argument is kind of like targeting in drone strikes. It's like, no, topicality is not drone strikes. You don't get bombed out of the, like you reading an app, like you're not just like terminally destroyed by like a drone that comes overhead. It's like, it seems kind of stupid, but you do want to sort of tease out the differences in the two logics to make sure to make the argument that's like, it's obviously different, right? So it's like, it's better than just being like, it's different, period. You need to have some explanation. Okay. Sometimes it's not as silly. Okay. So it's like, let's say, they've made a set of impact turn arguments about sort of, the way that sort of the community has imposed, pathologizing tropes on certain populations. So let's say, maybe there's an impact turn in there that's like, topicality is kind of like the silencing of women's voices when they talk about gender in debates. It's like, you might still be able to trace a no link argument that's just like, well, like a topicality argument doesn't say like women can't speak about gender. It says that, there needs to be a certain floor of we need to talk about security cooperation that you can attach discussions to gender to. It just can't be like free flow, right? So it's like you want to make sort of an initial no linker. All right, the second sort of prong, does the ballot or counter interpretation remedy? Okay, this is a pretty important one. Okay, so a lot of affirmative impact turns will be focused on debate community violence. So they'll say things like judge preferences are terrible. Oftentimes people will pref white judges to the detriment of black judges who will not be preferred because they like, policy arguments. Or, another argument that people might make will be like, oftentimes the sort of microaggressive tactics people have in between debates or in cross examinations, like that proves that there is like a type of sort of racism, sexism, etc., that exists in debates. Fair assessment, right? But the thing that you kind of want to trouble is sort of the idea that topicality is the thing that causes the impact. It's like, if there was no longer topicality arguments, would that remedy the violence that is being described? That's kind of the core question, right? So if I said, let's say I made the argument that's just like the debate community has a history of racism, like they've done terrible things to people of color, and oftentimes is a white predominated activity. It's like, do you think that those things would go away if we no longer had topicality as a genre of argument and only had dissets, counterpoints, and critiques? It's like, maybe not, right? It's like, my guess is that people's behavior, it's like, is still going to be pretty bad, even if they don't have T arguments. The sort of pref practices thing, it's like, I don't think that getting rid of T necessarily will fix the pref practice, right? So the argument that you would make there is you would want to say something like, topicality does not remedy the thing you're talking about. There's sort of two sort of subsets to that. One is the counterinterp doesn't remedy. So you could be like, let's say I was like, 1AC was about the plight of Asian people in debate, okay? And I was like, Asian people can violate the topic anytime. That's my counterinterpretation. You can kind of make the argument that's just like, why is it the fact that your counterinterpretation that just has Asian people debate whatever topic fix anti-Asian violence? Like, that doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? It's like, it's not like the violence against Asian people was caused by the topic. It's caused by a larger set of systemic impacts about, maybe a model minority myth, maybe the idea of meritocracy, maybe a certain set of white supremacist ideas that are probably not just related to topic constraint, right? So it's like the counterinterp does not remedy. The sort of second way to say it doesn't remedy is like the ballot does not remedy. So it's like, let's say the AF is like anti-blackness is a structuring condition of the world. It's like, okay, true, but like, why is a ballot in a single competitive debate going to fix that? Like, it's not really something that solves that impact. On the other hand, a ballot could correct the fairness violation that happened in a single debate, right? It's like the ballot is a pretty limited tool, so you can make the set of arguments. It's like the ballot does not remedy the impact that you're talking about, okay? Third one, it's a double turn with the counter interpretation. So this is the one that I think you mentioned for a second. It's like, let's say I made the argument that like topicality is like a prison, and then I was like, counter interpretation, the USFG is an assemblage of people. It's like, that's a little weird and kind of a double turn, because the whole point of your impact turn was like, we should never constrain anyone's thoughts. And the counter interp was like, we should have different constraints, right? It's like, yeah, like the jail was like a little bit too narrow. So like jail is a little bit broader now. It's like that doesn't really, that still links to the impact turn, right? So you can make the argument that oftentimes sort of, less constrained impact turns are a double turn with very narrow counter interpretations. You'll see this happen a lot when I think K teams get a little bit afraid, and they'll make counter interpretations that are more narrow to be perceptually more limited. So they'll be like, oh, our interpretation is limited and debatable. But a lot of the problem with that is that it's very much in contrast, or it's kind of in tension with the idea that's just like, we should not procedurally constrain anybody functionally, which is what the impact turn oftentimes says, right? So it's like, the impact turns that sort of exist oftentimes clash with the counter. So you want to put each impact turn that they make through that sort of three-pronged test and be like, does it link? Like, is this really truly a description of topicality? Can your counter interpretation or a ballot fix the problem you're talking about? And then finally, is it a double turn with the counter interpretation? It's like kind of the three-pronged test. Do people have questions about just like that test, or like what the sort of three parts are and how to sort of do that? I think when you're starting to get used to, so it's like, if you're not used to doing topicality arguments against planless apps yet, something that really helped me is I wrote down this three-prong test on like a piece of paper or a Post-it, and I like, or if you're like a normal human, you can just have it on like a note on the computer. It's like, you should have it in the side. So it's like, anytime you hear an argument they make, you should like look back at the three-prong test and then like basically put the arguments through the thing. Sometimes more than one thing will apply. So like, it might be the case both that it doesn't link and the ballot doesn't solve it, or the ballot doesn't solve it and it links to the counter interpretation, right? But you'll sort of go through that prong, and it's like, once you're good at it, you should not have to look at sort of that three-prong test. You should be able to just sort of like naturally do it. That's kind of the process of getting a little bit better. Final part of this conversation, so TVA, etc. So this might put me in the minority of judges, but I kind of think topical version of the AF is like irrelevant to the debate. Like, I just don't think it has any relevance. Here's sort of my rationale for why, and then I'll also describe why people think it's important. Let's go back to that hypothetical way back up. So like, let's say I read an affirmative that was just like asteroids. they're coming. NATO, don't talk about NATO. Asteroids, extinction. Extinction outweighs. It's like, it's not the negative's burden to describe why the AF that was not topical is part of the topic, right? It's like, there's no reason why the negative should have the burden to be like, oh, actually, no, like asteroids are a really important part of security cooperation over artificial intelligence. It's like, no, that's not your burden, right? Like, your burden is also not to provide a card that's like, oh yeah, like you can talk about NATO and cyber and also asteroids. It's like, no, you don't need to find that card. It's not really the negative's burden. A lot of times people have written affirmatives in such a way that a TVA is largely impossible. I think that's very true of this topic, okay? So this topic, people are going to be criticizing, for example, the Eurocentric, nature of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization or the militarized nature of security cooperation. Sorry, there's not a TVA. Like like most cards that you're reading are saying NATO is good and that security cooperation through like the DoD is a good thing. So it's like what are you really reading here when you're reading TVA? Right? It's like that doesn't really get you much. Okay. So I think the way to think about like if you want to read a TVA, it's less like, a topical version of the affirmative. So teams will sort of make this argument that's like, so if you're on the negative reading, topicality against a planless affirmative, teams will say something like, we can learn about the same things that you want to learn about, except through a topical app. So if a 1AC is talking about, the importance of solving, gender issues, right? The 1NC, topicality argument could include a topical version of the AF. It's like, there is a way to read a topical AF about this. The United States federal government should increase security cooperation that, is, considers gender when thinking about artificial intelligence policy, right? It's like, it's their attempt to say, like, you could talk about your stuff, but through the topic. I generally think that's like not that great because I don't think so. Like that example I gave, the cards for that probably don't exist very well, right? It's like my guess is that the AF has a pretty big criticism of NATO too. So it's like TVA, read on the neg slightly better on this topic because I think most AFs will say NATO bad. It's like that is clearly a negative argument. And so it is worth making the argument that's just like, well, like you should have to debate affirmative, NATO security cooperation, but like leverage a lot of the criticisms you make on the neg. And I think that's probably the more powerful argument when you're thinking about it. Some thoughts about that. You don't necessarily need to win either of those positions to win the debate. So it's like, topical version of the AF should not be thought of like a counterplan that solves the AF, right? So if the AF is talking about gender issues and the activity of debate, and the neg is like, you could talk about gender, like US AI gender. It's like, that obviously doesn't talk about debate community issues. So like the topical version of the AF counterplan does not solve the AF, right? It's like, that is not like a great strategy. And instead, you should sort of think about the TVA as like, if you're debating a case list on a topicality argument against a plan, right? It's sort of a similar situation where it's like, we have a case list that includes a bunch of affirmatives that could include gender, but there's also a case list of affirmatives you would allow that would be really unfair and really impossible to debate, right? So it's like, that's kind of the way that I would leverage and describe a topical version of the AF rather than describing it as like, it's a counterplan that solves the case, because the counterplan almost always will not solve any of the case. Right. So that's sort of the thought that I have for that. Final notes about just sort of organization. 2&R. Okay. 2&R is a very difficult speech on topicality, usually, because the 1AR is likely spammed a bunch of stuff from the 2AC and then also made a bunch of new arguments. The sort of goal of the 2&R is a couple of things. You need to make, you want to establish sort of an initial overview that describes sort of the purpose of debate, right? So like kind of the stuff we talked about at the top. Right, you want to win that debate is primarily sort of a competition, and the fairness is a goal that both sides are seeking to achieve in some way or another. You want to describe that fairness turns the case, it turns the pedagogical outcomes that they have, and then finally, your overview might include something that kind of they've dropped, right? So it's like if they drop that reading it on the neg solves, you might include that, or they drop TVA. If they don't drop any arguments, I would not include any argument up top. I would just keep it in the line by line where they answered it. And then finally, the sort of last thing they want to do when you're doing the line by line is in the 2NC, you want to be a lot more sort of explanatory and have a lot more vertical depth in terms of arguments. And by vertical here, I mean like, let's say they make an impact turn. Like you used all three parts of the, 3-prong test. So you have 3 answers, right? 2&R, impossible to do. Like you're on a time constraint and you also need to get to case. So it's like you want to sort of pick the best response that you have for each argument instead of like all 3. And you can kind of determine that based on like figuring out what things that they answered and what things that they dropped, and then like pick the one that they had the least stuff explaining. and sort of go for that. And then like that'll let you collapse your 2 and R into something that's a little bit shorter and a little bit more manageable. Any questions about topicality against planless affirmative, the fairness version? Cool. 11:55. Enjoy lunch.